Clare, what's the biggest carbon misconception you get from doing these presentations? So Clare runs all over the countryside presenting, and so I just wondered if there's a common misconception that comes up.
Thanks, Pip. I think one of the things when we do the workshops, and we run these workshops, they're half-day workshops with producers, mainly livestock producers, is understanding where their emissions are coming from and how much livestock. So when we're thinking about greenhouse gases, we're thinking about carbon dioxide, we're talking about methane, we're talking about nitrous oxide. And in a livestock system, the methane is quite high. And when we talk about the numbers, so the profiles of those emissions coming from those farms, the fact that the methane emissions are so high from those ruminant animals. So those ruminant animals are eating that complex carbohydrates that Suze was talking about, and they're burping out that methane. And so when we look at those percentages, it's methane in that case. Cropping's a little bit different. And even in the dairy situation, when we're talking to dairy farmers, their numbers are a little bit different as well, because you can imagine a dairy farm, they're bringing in feed, for example. It's not just the emissions. They've also got urea on pastures and things like that too. So their profiles are very different in each of the ag industries.
Thank you. Macka, or Robert, I should call you, sorry. If you could do anything differently with what you've done with your carbon neutral, what would that be? Including, would you do earlier?
Probably stay at school longer, maybe. Probably had jumped on the train a bit earlier. Obviously, when we took our first soil sampling across our operation, we already had substantial amounts of carbon, so we probably missed that boat a little bit. But I tend to just focus on what's in front. I don't worry about what's behind. And obviously that's why we're here today, is to say just start the journey, because it's an important journey. It's a journey you're going to have to take no matter what. You're better off making that step forward than, like I said before, being told to do it. And your customers will reward you, I promise. Or they'll pay you a premium anyway, and that's what you've got to focus on, okay? But, yep, I wish I started a bit earlier. Thank you.
Ian, you mentioned that GrainGrowers as an industry group are talking to government or the powers that be to develop a common framework and methodology for calculators, and also potentially getting into the Regional Investment Corporation to allow some of those activities that reduce low emissions to be eligible. Are they listening?
Yeah, I think they are listening. It was quite interesting. We have had an ag minister change in the last few months, but on a federal side, like Murray Watts was really involved in this space. He understood it quite well. And, he took a real interest in making sure that the market does work properly, which was a nice response from a politician. You don't always get that. And I guess this industry is viewed a little bit at the moment with the potential with some snake oil sort of participants. And I use that as a very common broad term. But so it's important that we get some common standards coming out of it, so that's removed, and it makes it a lot easier for farmers going forward to do what they need to do and not get caught up in doing some of the stuff that you probably don't need to do.
Tim, is there... So Rabo is national but also international. Is there stuff happening overseas, I guess, or whether that's policy or changes that you think are coming towards Australia, or you think the Australian context is different enough that we can manage our environment and our industries that suit the way that would suit us, I guess, within those international regulations?
Look, I think the reality is, because we are an exporting nation, we can't ignore what's happening overseas, right? And so insofar as if 70 to 80% of what we produce ends up on a boat or on a plane or somehow gets to another market, then it is really important to make sure that we understand what some of those regulations or what some of those trading environments are actually, how they are changing. And I think a prime example is clearly the EU seems to be moving a lot faster than some of the other markets. And so if you have exposure in the EU, then you've got to think about, well, what is it that is important for them? And sort of as I mentioned in my presentation this morning, then you can kind of see how some of these mechanisms might end up being extended to agriculture, and a prime example is is really how they're looking to support their local production, and then potentially there could be things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms play out over time. It doesn't extend to ag yet, but you could see how it potentially could, as there's more pressure from local producers that are forced to live up to those standards, to say, well, if we're a local producer in an EU country, then everyone's got to really play by the same rules if they're going to export there. For us as well, yeah, absolutely. We're an international food and agri bank, so we do take a look at what's happening in South America as well. We've got big exposure in Brazil, but the reality is every region's got their own issues, and so I think whilst it's good to have an eye on that, the focus needs to be on what you're doing locally, and think about what those activities are. What's that low-hanging fruit that you can actually control that's in your sphere of influence right here.
Suze, you talked about the ACCU scheme and the others touched on that as well, and the soil carbon methodology. What is it about the ACCU scheme? Because we talked about buying cheap credits from Brazil, for example, which is perfectly legal. But why is the ACCU scheme and the soil carbon methodology in Australia? What sets it apart from other international standards or carbon protocols?
Thank you. I hate the name ACCU scheme because it just sounds so sneaky, right? So the soil carbon method in Australia is renowned kind of globally for being one of the most highest integrity. It's not to say that it's perfect, but in terms of other international voluntary carbon methods for soil carbon, it's held up there as being one of the, if not the best. And that's because it does represent progress, not perfection. So we've had a method in 2014, 15, 18, and we've got one now in 2021, which is the revision based on new science, new evidence, and also the practical application of the method, so making it work. And because of that offset integrity standards, so you have an independent set of scientists which advise the minister on approval of this method, which make sure that the change is additional, that it's permanent, that it's evidence-based, and that it's conservative. So it's got very, very science-based standards which underpin it, which kind of brings integrity into the ACCU, and that's why ACCUs have a high value and will likely to maintain that high value. For me, when I look at the voluntary market, yeah, absolutely, there's a role for those, and we've got clients that participate in those. But if I just want to talk about that integrity piece for the ACCU scheme, I think it's really the audit regime that actually is considered quite over and above what's evident for some of the other international schemes, because you've got your offsets that you have to produce every year or however often you want to report, which actually shows, well, what are you doing on farm? Are you fulfilling all your obligations under your land management agreement? Is there that abatement occurring in line with the model? But then there's also the actual physical audits, and we've actually seen these gateway checks, and they're actually leading to some actually big changes in carbon abatement areas having to change quite significantly. So that is actually a risk that needs to be obviously managed, because you might have a project thinking you're going to get X amount of ACCUs over your 25-year crediting period, but subject to these regular gateway checks, if you're not actually that physical evidence of abatement isn't there, then you will see some actual can be some significant reductions in your ability to produce ACCUs in the future. And then there's also the reversal events as well. So if you're not fulfilling your obligations, then there's also that risk that you might have to relinquish or hand back ACCUs if you're not fulfilling. So you can sort of see how they've built the legislation and the practice to make sure that it's as high integrity as possible.
So I'm a farmer. I've got a couple of thousand acres, and I've got some bush on my place, and I've I don't know if there's some nice birds in there I like as well, and I want to know what's available. How can you help me?
From our point of view, we'll go on site to have a chat to you about what you found, what direction and what's your aim at the end of the day. We do use a lot of in-house mapping beforehand, which gives us a bit of a brief idea on tree species that are available, flora and fauna that's there, soil types, and any other sites, even being Aboriginal heritage sites. We bring those up as well to see if that's an impediment or not. And then after we've gone through, we come up with a report that gives you suggestions on directions to take, and basically, as we said before, have the confidence to ask the right questions to the right firms, whoever you're dealing with. And then we just follow through after that to seeing how you're going with the whole project, and hopefully come up with some resolutions from there.
Question to Sue. With the 2021 soil method, we've now got modelling in there as part of the projected abatement. What methods or what types of modelling do you see the soil industry using to support increases in soil carbon, if you're doing that in between your measuring?
So as background, the soil carbon method started as measurement only. Scientifically, beautiful piece of method, right? It's absolute bastard to implement as a carbon service provider, which I was not one at the time. I was one of the scientists that designed it. And then the next method that came out was purely modelling. So conservative though, there was nothing to be made for farmers to participate. 2018, tried to bring the two together. 2021, what we now have is there's a measurement only option, and then there's the hybrid approach where you measure, model, and then remeasure over a 10-year cycle. And that's what Anne's talking about. The models that I think are getting used, and certainly that we use, are all biogeochemical models. So they have all of the kind of crunchy soil stuff that I just spoke about. So how the type of carbon moves through soil, we need to know the fractions, we model that. The soil parameters, so how much clay, the density of the soil, the climate, how much rainfall does it get, so that means it's a biogeochemical model. Then it has a plant process model. And the inputs for that plant process model are often remotely sensed variables. So the amount of biomass that's grown, so that drives the carbon input part. So there's different models. There's Century, Daycent, Rothsea. None of them probably just sounds like I'm speaking another language. And different carbon service providers will use different models and can use different models. The most important thing is it's a hard number for the baseline. So it's a physical soil sample that's collected well. And then the next thing is the model, and then you have to remeasure to say that model estimate was within an acceptable range. So it's not a BS number.
Probably a question for Tim and maybe Claire, but with the financial disclosure reporting coming in next year for big corps, how do you think this will impact ag, and will there be a demand from big corporations looking for some kind of environmental market on agriculture land?
Yeah, really good question, because that is I think a big shift that's going to come in the next few years. But those financial reporting obligations are just going to be for those big companies, Scope 1 and Scope 2 initially, and then it will extend to Scope 3, I think, in 2027. So what that means is they will need to make some assessments in terms of what their exposures are to climate-related financial risks and nature-related financial risks. My guess, and it is a guess because we talk to the large corporates around where they're going to get their data from, I think it will probably be, a top-down approach, and they'll look to use models to try and understand what those different scenarios look like. But obviously, the more bottom-up and better data that they can get will replace it, because it's pretty clunky from a top-down point of view. So what are the opportunities as well for farms that are focused on being more climate resilient, that are sequestering a lot of carbon on farm, that can show what they're doing and have the credentials, and importantly have the measurement? They're naturally going to be the ones that will find themselves closer to the front of the queue, or have those access to markets opportunities as wide open as possible. When we can say that'll hit and to what extent is sort of anyone's guess, but directionally that sort of gives you an idea of what's happening over and above their voluntary commitments.
I think you'll see a big push from government and industry sources to get some solid averages, especially in the cropping side, so they can use some realistic numbers, because otherwise, I mean, they're not going to be able to accumulate accurate data all the way through the supply chain. So I think there's a bit of a push there now from industry and the government to get those numbers, which removes a lot of worry and burden for the farming community, that it won't be pushed down on us to do it.
On that as well, in Canada, the beef industry have started to pull together a whole lot of numbers and data for different regions of Canada, so that when the supply chain, supermarkets, for example, ask for an emissions info for the cattle sector, they can provide that as an average.
I guess maybe to Robert, to you, I know there's been some, I'm assuming you run predominantly Black Angus, maybe from what I've seen, and we talked about, lowering as much as you could the emissions that you were doing. Have you done any investigation into like different types of breeds of cattle that maybe would emit less methane, like Limousin or something like that? Just curious.
Yeah, no, look, I think we've invested too heavily into that Angus space with our genetics and our stud and all of that. As I said before, we are focused on producing a more sustainable animal. We need to measure that on farm, and hopefully 2025 we'll be able to play around with our genetics to see if certain animals have different characteristics to reducing methane, and obviously bringing in genetics from Scotland to make an animal more productive on farm is a big focus on ours also. But no, not going to go down into that crossbred space. Dad wanted to relive some childhood memory and turned up with a couple of Hereford bulls to create a baldy paddock, and so it tends to be a bit of a sore point in our family that he's got. Well, last time we got him in, I said, Dad, it was supposed to be 60. There's 120 there now. What's going on? He said, oh, no, those black ones, they'll go back in anyway. So that's enough crossbreeding.
Yeah.
But, look, a lot of those things will come out. Yeah, crossbreeding, a certain animal, there's no doubt, will produce less methane, and crossed over with an Angus or a Charolais or something. So that's the future, and we need to keep pushing forward to push the boundaries and just come up with new ways, and hopefully someone here will be doing that in the near future, won't we? Yes.
The other thing that you are doing that is reducing methane is just getting your cattle to live weight gain quicker, which you spoke about before, and that is a really good methane emissions intensity reduction strategy, and that's just by having the better pastures to graze on. So that's and that's not anything to do necessarily with genetics. That's just really good land management practice.
I was going to ask a question at the end for everyone, the same question, but I feel like I know what the answer will be, but I'll ask it anyway. Is what's your one takeaway for everyone to do from coming here today, whether that's a advisor, a consultant or a farmer? What's the one takeaway?
There's a gap between what the major companies and their representatives on the ground, whether it be Woolworths, Coles, Nutrien, Elders and so on, they haven't filled the gap in between the first person the farmer talks to, which is an agent of some nature. It doesn't matter if they're agronomy or meat and wool. And I think there needs to be a rise in education, because what we've discussed here is that it's on its way, but there's a big gap into those who are actually not taking that message on.
For me, it's simple. You can't manage what you can't measure. So I just say you just got to get that calculation done and listen to what Macka says. That's the other piece of advice.
That took me 2 minutes to think of that. Can't believe it. Look, I suppose sustainability can equal profitability. I would agree with that. Also, I just think just get on the journey. Any change, and as long as you document it, is a positive step forward. Okay, so thanks, Jim.
I'm pretty similar. Measure it, understand it, and look at it as an opportunity, not a threat.
Okay, I think you know what I'm going to say is know your numbers. So know about your emissions. Use some of those calculators. See what you're missing. And not just do it over 1 year, but start thinking that it's over a number of years, because we've heard today several times that some things actually increase those emissions. You put lime out, some years you don't put any fertilisers out, and we've seen that as well. So I think that it's not just 1 year, it's over a number of years, and start understanding what are the levers that you can start to pull to what the scenarios that you can do, the pathways you can do to start thinking about lowering those emissions, and what does that mean for your bottom line as well. So those trade-offs that might occur. So if you're going to go ahead and do something about emissions, and it's in that part that you think, right, I can do that, what does it cost me? And what are the win-wins or the win-losers in that situation in terms of trade-offs? So understanding where those emissions are coming from, what you can do with them, and what does it cost you? And it's not just dollars, but also what happens if you do that. So that's my answer.
It's always hard going last, and there's all good responses. Being the only soil scientist in the room, don't treat soil like dirt. So, like it gets said all the time, like soil supports healthy plant life, it supports our livestock, it supports our cropping industries. Carbon is a key enabler of that within soil, and it's really important for public health as well. So clean air, fresh water. So value soil, not only for the carbon credit that it can be produced, but also for what it does for our environment.